Next, we want to go to Lynn McNeil, and she's going to talk about how to use Instagram to bring hope in the epicenter of a global pandemic. So, Lynn, why don't you share with us what you've seen and what you've done?
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm Lynn, and I'm going to get straight to it. Instagram is an incredibly useful tool for anyone who isn't too familiar with it. It's the most widely used social media platform among our target audience of students in Italy. And our Instagram account is at Agape Studenti, so you can look at that to see practical examples of what I'm talking about here. Instagram has a lot of aspects that allow you to connect and engage with your followers, including direct messaging that helps build a lot of personal relationships. It's important to note also at the start that the principles I'm talking about here can be applied to both personal as well as corporate Instagram accounts. For example, the principles are relevant for both a pastor's personal account as well as a church's corporate account. And it's also good to note that no matter how proficient you are or your organization is in Instagram, these ideas can be implemented at both a small scale as well as a large scale. So of the 27 million users on Instagram, there is your audience. So let's assume that you know who your audience is and you know who you want to reach with this message of hope. So what are their needs? Ultimately, in this webinar, I'm going to be addressing their need for hope, but how they receive that hope will differ depending on their circumstance. So to illustrate this point, I'm going to share what we experienced here in Italy. Week one of Italy experiencing this pandemic, we were at a stage of the crisis where people were confused. There wasn't clear direction from the government. Some things were open, some things weren't. And it was pretty chaotic. So during that week, we sent out daily seeker-friendly reflections to students from our account via the direct messaging service. These reflections were about how to find comfort in God in times of crisis and chaos. The next week, the lockdown had been implemented. We were all in quarantine, and people were actually pretty excited by this new challenge. They were feeling positive about being able to make a difference, and morale was strangely high. So we did a series of fun stories and posts about the opportunity that this quarantine presented, about how to make the most of the quarantine, to read that book you've always been wanting to read, or to finish the DIY in your house, as well as practical tips on how to build a routine, especially for a studying student. So fast forward to now in week 3, we've been in quarantine for well over 2 weeks, and morale is significantly lower. People are tired from all of their interaction being digital, and they're beginning to really feel the pain of social isolation. So we had predicted this and had prepared a series of reflections on walking with God in times of pain and suffering, with a practical step to do each day. Thinking forward to next week, week 4, our prediction is that people's mental health will begin to suffer from the amount of time in isolation. And so we are now preparing material to be able to meet that need come Monday. So as you can see, each week we tried to bring hope to our audience, but how we delivered that message of hope really changed depending on what the context was. And the more proactive you can be in meeting your audience's need, the better. Think ahead to how you can bring hope to your followers as their contexts change. So I mentioned earlier that Instagram is a great tool to engage with your followers. So what do I mean by engagement? Here are some examples, starting from the left. From Instagram, you can send followers to other places, for example, to a website. So what we did was we shared a story of a medical student who is on the front lines of dealing with this pandemic. And to keep reading about his story, you could follow a link to our website, where from there, there's a lot more helpful resources for students who are looking for hope at this time. Secondly, we also had a lot of our followers share our posts, which by proxy increased our audience and showed our account to be a resource for hope in this crisis to a whole new group of people. Thirdly, and personally the most exciting, I think, is that you can directly converse with your followers using direct messaging. We had personal conversations with over 50 students after sending out the daily reflections on week 1. And Eugene is pictured here. He's an example of this. He's not a Christian, and I knew him personally before, but we hadn't connected in a number of months. And he received the reflections that we sent back in week 1, and he replied with a voice note thanking us for the positive message. And 2 weeks later, we are still sending voice notes over Instagram. So it was a really cool tool to re-engage with Eugene. So this begs the question, what are we asking our followers to engage with? So content, basically. What are we posting to be delivering this message of hope? There's so much content out there right now being created by so many people, specifically in response to the crisis. There's a lot of people at home with a lot of time on their hands, and you can see it if you go online. So the important thing is to not be paralyzed by this challenge of having to create all of this perfect, relevant content. One of the main strategies that we've been employing here in Italy is sharing what our followers are already posting with their permission, obviously. Here is an example of that. Alessia shared her experience on her personal Facebook account. In it, she was acknowledging the pain, but also offering encouragement and tips on how to exercise at home and stay sane. I reached out to Alessia and said, your message was beautiful and encouraging, and we would love to share it with more people who we think would really benefit from hearing your story. This not only brings hope to the followers who then got to see Alessia's perspective from our account, but it also really encouraged Alessia. It's really nice to feel like your voice has value and can impact others. And it was a great relationship building tool for us and Alessia. Some of the stories that we've been sharing, or even asked our followers to write for us, have been positive and overtly hopeful, offering a lot of practical recommendations or Christian perspectives. But some have been sad and described a lot of the pain and the disappointment. For example, Simone posted on his personal Instagram about his disappointment over losing his student internship. We shared this on our story because we believe that there's hope even in that. People are connecting over this shared experience, even when it's painful, and it's hopeful to know that you're not alone in it. And in the next slide, you'll see that some of the content that we reposted hasn't been serious or even talked about the pandemic directly in any way. For example, back in week 2, when morale was high, we did a couple of posts on modified life in quarantine and what that looked like. So Tiziano and Francesca are performers and they're friends of Agape Studenti. They're normally on stage, but here they put on a show in their living room. They dressed up and performed a popular song from an Italian singing competition. And with their permission, we reposted it and got a lot of engagement from our followers that way. So thinking practically, I wanted to give you 3 practical action steps for you in your ministry context. First of all, think about your audience, your followers, what they're experiencing now and what would be valuable to them right now as well as next week. And don't be afraid to ask them as well. Also, think strategically about how you can engage with people using this tool. Familiarize yourself with the stories, the options to do quizzes and polls, and the fun gifts that are available on that, as well as connect directly with your followers in the comment section or through the direct messaging. There's a lot of tools, so make the most of those. And then lastly, don't be paralyzed by this challenge of having to create all of your own content. Look for relevant content that's already out there from many different sources and share it on your account if you think it'll be hopeful for people, with permission and credit, of course. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening, and I hope this gives you guys ideas of how you can bring some light to the dark Instagram feeds of your followers.